Hi, good afternoon. My name's Ryan Eldridge. I'm here today with Rich Collins, and we are here to talk about bridge financing. What is it and how to use it? This was originally scheduled to be more of a poster session at the CCSA conference, but thank you to CCSA for allowing us to do it more of in a breakout session format. I think what we'll do is alter what we were originally going to do and kind of put a little bit of an agenda and give you some examples of what we're talking about now. Why don't we take a quick look at the agenda, which is scheduled to cover who we are, the bridge financing, what is it exactly, and how to use it. We'll cover few actually school case studies, go into detail about different situations where schools utilize the bridge financing concept. Then we'll discuss some points around finding the right solution for your school, understanding that every school out there is unique and has its own unique situation. I think it's also true with the solution provider you would choose. And then at the end of it, we'll provide some contact information in case there's any follow-up questions that you may have for us. We're always here to help, and hope everybody's being safe and well out there right now under the current conditions. So with that, again, my name's Ryan Eldridge. I've been with Charter School Capital now for over 6 years. I am a father of three. And about 6 years ago, it's funny, I actually had to go through a series of meetings with different schools and to try to find the right situation for my daughter, who actually has an IEP and had some challenges, and we were trying to find the right fit rather than send her to the local district school. And so we ended up making and finding a decision on a choice school here in the Portland, Oregon area. And through that process, I learned quite a bit about how different each school setting is, how kids learn differently, the significance of that. And so to me, it became very important for me to kind of get more involved in that process, as I have two other boys who, again, different personalities, learn completely differently, and go to different schools other than my daughter. So for me, this opportunity to work and help serve the charter community and the mission that they have to serve students that are currently being underserved is, obviously a great experience and something I've been doing for the last 6 years and hope to do it for a lot longer. I'm joined by Rich Collins. Rich, you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. So my name is Rich Collins. I'm the Director of Strategy and Product Development at Charter School Capital. I've been with Charter School Capital for about 2 years. Prior to that, I spent about 7 or so years between sort of getting my MBA and spending time in financial and strategy consulting roles. I was looking at Charter School Capital and wanted to come to an organization that had more of a social impact, and I found it here at Charter School Capital. I sit in the Portland office, but right now I'm broadcasting from my 1-bedroom apartment to create distance between me and Ryan. But what I really like is taking a lot of the things that I learned from working with Fortune 500 financial services companies, banks, and insurance institutions, and applying that kind of at a different scale with charter schools who, in some ways, face more financial headwinds than a lot of those institutions. So it's been great to be here at Charter School Capital and apply a lot of what I've learned in my past life to charter schools. So we can dive right into the material now, and this is meant to be about bridge financing. So bridge financing, what is it? I think the first thing that we would want to talk about, and if you flip to the next page, would be what is it actually a bridge to? When we're talking about bridge financing, it's implied that there's some sort of time frame associated with it. I'm just waiting for my slide to load here. Thank you. So we think of bridge financing, and most folks would do this, is it's really a bridge to long-term permanent facilities financing, mainly facilities financing. So that includes bonds, mortgages, any sort of long-term kind of stable financing solution. And most of that is available to schools and any institution that has really a stable financial position. So if we're thinking about what bridge financing is, we think about it as anything really that allows a school to get to that long-term stable financing. So if you think about an example school timeline, bridge financing really is anything prior to that long-term financing. And that could be used specifically for say projects to like development projects. It could be specifically to pay architects to do some drawings on a site or a location. It could be paying for improvements on a facility that you either own or you rent and are looking to own. There's any sort of number of specific uses of that financing, but it could also be used to improve the financial stability of a school. So in some ways, growth capital could be viewed as a bridge to getting a school to a stable financial position. So as I'm looking at this slide, this is the options and common structures for bridge financing or this bridge period. So you can of course pay for growth, or you can pay for a lot of improvements out of any reserves that you have currently. So that obviously has some pros and some cons associated with that. There's instruments like term loans or lines of credit or receivable sale. Those are all mechanisms to go to a third party and infuse your institution with additional cash in order to pay for additional investments or fuel growth to provide stability. So most of the focus of what we'll be talking about is really these components or these instruments that you could be looking at, like term loans. The point of this is really to say that each of these mechanisms is going to have trade-offs. So if you're paying for something out of reserves, then there's obviously no interest costs associated with that. But if at the same time your goal is to build up reserves so that you qualify for a bond, paying down reserves might not be prudent trade-off for the lack of interest costs that you would have. Same thing with something like a term loan. Term loans will have generally predictable payment structures, but they might have some covenants and restrictions associated with them, and it could be tough to expand those if your situation changes. So we'll talk more about some of the considerations you might have when evaluating different options. And one of the main considerations that applies to any type of financing is really what the collateral is that you are using to get that financing. If you have something that's an uncollateralized loan, there's a lot more risk for someone who's lending you that money. So there's generally a higher interest rate associated with that, but there might be less restrictions with that. And if something is collateralizing, say, property that you own, whether you're looking to expand to a new facility and you have expansion plans like that, if you have a loan on an existing facility or a mortgage or bond, that's going to potentially prevent you from borrowing additional capital to expand into a new location. So I will hand this back to Ryan to actually walk through some examples of where schools have used bridge financing, some in conventional ways and then some in some not so conventional ways.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. In this a couple of situations. So I think this will just give you kind of some examples of how schools are using it in different circumstances. So let's take school, the first one, case study one. This one was a particular situation where a school, long-term school, good enrollment, good grades, had been leasing district use space in California. They had been jumping around and been, forced to shift locations a couple of times by the district. And so because of that, they were looking for a long-term home that they could call their own. They had already started to work with bond financing and were a good halfway, three-quarters of the way through the process of going to bond on acquiring the land and then building out a new facility. Just to give you a little background, the school had gone through years of trying to locate the perfect property. They had properties under contract. Some of them dropped out. Some of them had zoning issues. And for one reason or another, this happened for a multitude of years, and the right opportunity never fell into place. So finally, they got this piece of land in the perfect location. Demographics of their school fit perfectly, and everything was working towards closing on the property through bond financing. The landlord, or the owner of the property, had it under contract for multiple months. Due to the longevity of the time frame it takes, bonds just take some time. Sometimes there's just a lot to go through, and it takes a long time to market. So because of that, there all of a sudden became a breaking point with the seller, where the seller was a bit frustrated with how long it was taking to close on the property. They were threatening that they were going to, drop the contract, keep the deposits that the school had made on the property, and move on to a new buyer. And so due to this, there was a very short window. And so we understood what the problem was, is that they needed to acquire this land, needed to get it under contract, and needed to get going on some of the development of the property while they waited for this bond to close. We worked with the long-term financing that was in place, which is the bond investors, and all agreed that what we could do is bridge structure that would allow the school to acquire the land, close on the property, own it, and actually have it in their hands so that they could actually fulfill their dream, which is to build a brand new property on here. What they came to us with, and what the need really was really short term. It was 6 months. They just needed about another 6-month window to make sure that everything worked out on the bond. And so understanding that, it made most sense for all parties involved to create a short-term bridge financing solution, which was a 6-month term. Since it was only such a short term, it didn't make a lot of sense to create a lot of principal and interest type payments on that 6 months. So we structured it on a 6-month term, interest only during that period, amortized over a longer period of time. And we also know that from our experiences that sometimes, even though, there's a plan and it's going to close in 6 months, it doesn't always happen that way. So what we didn't want to do is put the school into a long-term financial problem. And if we thought that if there was any chance that bond didn't close in 6 months, the school would be stuck with a pretty hefty balloon payment on our loan that could put the school into quite a bit of trouble if that bond didn't come through. So just as a precautionary measure, as a safety net for all parties involved, we also had a default so that after the 6-month term, should the bond not fund, the loan would automatically default to a 3-year term with principal and interest payments that were affordable for the school and wouldn't put them into a long-term problem should it not close. At the end, everything worked out as scheduled and planned, and everybody was happy, and the school was able to acquire the property and get going on their bond project. So that's the first case. Rich, do you want to cover the second one?
Yep. So the second case, and just to clarify, Ryan said that the loan wouldn't default, and the loan would just automatically switch to
which is sorry.
Which we actually wanted to prevent from a loan defaulting. That was a key consideration of ours, and we wanted to make sure that in case things didn't work out, that the school would be fine in case that the bond didn't come in on time. So for the second case, this is a little less usual, but it's a really sort of creative way the school used financing to actually generate some savings right off the bat. So a school that we worked with was actually looking at buying out of. They were involved in a bond transaction, which was set to close, I think, 3 or 4 months away from when they contacted us. The school was buying out of a state retirement plan and transitioning employees to a self-run retirement savings plan, like a 403b. The school, in building reserves to prep for the bond, they didn't want to spend down reserves, and they didn't have enough cash to do that and also to buy out of the state retirement program. So when they came to us, we actually structured a loan that was I think it was a shorter term loan, but it's similar to the last situation, had a longer amortization schedule, and had similar safety nets in case the bond transaction took longer than expected. And the buyout actually generated about $300,000 of annual savings for the school just by switching out of this retirement program. So it helps to create more financial stability, generate more savings for the school, and ultimately more money that they can put back into the program and expand on their education program.
Okay, so let's give you another scenario. This is the third case study. This one was a little bit different. This was a school out of Texas that had gone through some rough times over the last few years. Kind of just a little backstory again. Long-standing school, great academics, great enrollment numbers. Due to a landlord that was not agreeable with, helping them out with TIs and expanding the operation and raising rent in a short period of time, the school made a decision to move a few miles away into a different facility. This was 2 or 3 years ago. Once they moved, they got into that new location. Things were consistent and doing well, and then they were hit with a natural disaster, which was a hurricane, and it was in a flood zone. And the school was impacted tremendously during that period of time after they had shifted. While all that was going on, and the school was still maintaining their enrollments and their grades miraculously, a prior board member had bought the old property back, allowed them to move back into their old facility, and that was outside the floodplain. And then they had to move yet once again within about a 2-year period of time. So they incurred a lot of moving expenses during this time, a lot of one-time unexpected fees and expenses that they normally would not incur, but had to do this in their transitions both one way and then back again into the other school. And so during that time, they took advantage of a lot of these shorter-term, high-interest loans. And over a period of time, between landlords giving some short-term loans or private investors or almost merchant account agreements, they had some pretty high-interest loans, and it was about 9 in total. Some of them varying in rates, some substantially higher than others, but it was causing a monthly debt service, as you can see from the chart, of about $115,000 a month. That was causing big strain on their cash flows. They had a little bit of a dip in enrollment based on all the changes, but they still had a strong academic track record. Growth and encouragement from the rest of the community was that they were going to continue to grow and thrive. And so with that, we could see the long-term picture, understanding exactly what it is that they were trying to do. What we were able to do is, instead of a bridge to bond or something like that, is just simply put together a shorter-term loan to help consolidate that debt, which would save them tremendously on the monthly debt service. And we took their $115,000 a month payments all the way down to $28,000 a month. We simply set it up as a 12-month loan with a longer-term 15-year type amortization schedule to provide lower monthly payments. And then that 12-month loan was able to be refinanced over multiple years. And so by doing this quickly, they're experiencing and starting to realize, as you can see, close to $80,000, $75,000 in monthly savings, starting to build up their cash reserves, getting back on writing their ship and where they should be. And so this is just again, yet another scenario that bridge financing or the concept of bridge financing could be used. Again, we brought up there's probably 15 other cases that we could bring up in different scenarios, but these are just a few to give you an understanding of how it can be used. So. Rich, I think you might be on mute. There you go.
Sorry, on mute. Those were some were conventional, some are unconventional ways to use bridge financing. And I think this next series of slides, we'll talk a little bit about, we'll take a step back and talk more generally about what you should be looking for and what maybe you should be avoid or thinking about considerations for bridge financing in general. So flip to the next page, and this, so we're going to use an analogy here, and I'm sure everyone's heard of the, generally about icebergs and the danger that they have. So we don't want to be scary here when we're talking about financing. But generally speaking, I think similar to an iceberg, if you flip to the next page, please, then, typically most folks can see and can understand the expenses tied to financing. So it's sort of the obvious thing that most people spot right away. And this includes interest expense, origination fees or transaction fees, refinancing fees. Fees are sort of a necessary component of any financing. Given that a lender is taking risk, they need to be paid for that risk. But one of the things that I think we run into a lot is when we think about expenses, we try to translate that to total dollars for our clients. And what we do in doing that is we do a couple things. One is we translate kind of the percentages and some of those things that are quoted on an annual basis, and we really break it down into what's the transaction going to cost. And it's important to do that because one of two reasons. One is sometimes the fees, sometimes the interest rates are quoted in a certain way, or an origination fee, if it's over 1 month, is at a higher annualized rate than if it's over 12 months. And it's important to think about the fees in the context of the total project size. What are you actually financing? So if you have a low interest rate for something that's going to finance 60% of a project cost, you're still going to have to come up with 40%, which is either out of cash reserves, which you could be using for other purposes, or maybe there's a second lender you might have to reach out to get that remaining 40%, which likely would be unsecured and at a much higher rate. So your blended costs could be potentially much higher, even though one institution is offering you very low interest rate. The other thing too is to think about the total cost of a project relative to the total life of what that project means to you. So if you're purchasing a building and you're looking at, say, a 30-year bond, if you're borrowing for 2 to 3 to 6 months to, say, wrap up some costs associated with getting into that bond, generally those investments are going to be much smaller than the total, bond that you take out. In the first case that we gave, I think the amount of bridge financing that school needed was 1/10 of the total bond that they were going to be taking out on the building. So it's shorter term, and it's generally for a smaller dollar amount that you need bridge financing for. That's not always the case, but in some senses, that's sort of a good way to look at it. I'll flip over to Ryan to talk about the next piece.
So as far as the above the water, there's also the below the water with an iceberg, right? And sometimes it's more hidden underneath than there is above. So things to think about. There's opportunity costs. that you may not really think of firsthand. You're thinking interest rates, cost, that makes sense. But what about the other factors that also have a financial impact? So one of those could be, delays or meeting the key milestones. For instance, the school start dates. Most schools start in August or September. If by financing delays, this may push the opening of school for a particular year, that could obviously have a huge impact on enrollment numbers that you may not be able to recover from. In the first example we gave, there was a property that was under contract and the possibility of losing deposits if they didn't close on the property in a particular time, let alone losing the property itself. So things of that nature. The loss of the optimal location. Had they not got that property, they also would have been impacted by not having the location of their dreams. Other areas to consider, the financial goals, building the cash reserves. So oftentimes to go to bond, you have to have a heavy reserve account, and maybe not being able to build on that cash because you had to utilize it to actually spend on other, significant things such as acquiring the property. It could be better use as far as trying to use those cash reserves to build the growth of the school so that long term, the affordability of any debt service you may be taking on down the road, makes sense. So all these things have to be considered. First off, I think you do have to think about the best use of the cash you have on hand, as well as, the trade-offs from finding the lowest cost solution versus the cost from delays. So, you may have a thought that you should be getting a lower rate, and you could spend a lot of time meeting with many different lending institutions to try to find the best and lowest cost solution, at the same time causing great delays by not picking one and running with it to make sure that the long-term vision doesn't get lost in all of that. So, Rich, you want to take on the next slide?
Yeah. The third piece here is thinking about the structure of the solution. So if you think about that slide that we had, that had the different piece. Sorry, if you go back. If you think about the slide we had before, which showed the different options or different ways you could go about financing pretty much anything, there's going to be trade-offs there. So if you have a structure that's very low cost, it likely has additional restrictions and covenants tied to it. And again, that's because it's low cost, because it reduces the risk for the lender. Outside of that, there could be different options you could have, some with even unrealistic payment schedules that don't make sense for a bridge period. So an example could be, say you're moving into a new location and you have a 2-year window where you don't have an open school, but now you have potentially a loan tied to helping to develop that second location in some way. If that is a 2-year loan, it means you're going to have to pay back, and if it's amortized over 2 years, it means that your monthly payments are going to be pretty substantial, and you might not be generating any revenue to help support that bridge period. So it's important to think about whether or not the structure makes sense for your realistic budget over the period of time. And then the thing that we alluded to in the examples was looking for solutions and asking whoever your lender is for some form of optionality. So in case things do get delayed, and you are behind on milestones, that there's the ability to easily and kind of inexpensively restructure the loan or whatever instrument it is to give you some relief. And speaking about kind of covenants and restrictions, again, much like interest expense, there will be some level of restrictions or covenants. It's just making sure that they're reasonable and that they don't prohibit you from operating your school, which is the number one priority, is allowing you the flexibility to actually manage your school and grow and get into that financially stable position. I'll let Ryan talk about the last piece here.
All right. This one specifically is the capability of the solution provider. So as you're out there and you're interviewing different solution providers, just keep in mind they have to have a pretty good understanding of the charter space. Charter space, I think you can all agree, is very unique. Every school is different. Every school has a different purpose they're serving or style that they provide to the local communities and the kids they serve. So be it as the issues that they may run into in that particular community, whether it's zoning issues or timing issues or property or land availability, all these things come into play. And then the question of, do they understand how a charter school gets funded? Do they understand the payment streams? Do they understand how to underwrite a charter school based on enrollment projections and growth projections, with the idea that, again, things don't always work out as planned, so how will they adjust to that? So make sure they have a track record, with similar projects for charter schools, and that, they do understand the challenges that charter leaders face out there. Make sure that the motivations and incentives should be, aligned with your goals. You're out there to serve students. You're trying to fulfill the mission. You're trying to help the community. All this comes into play. Just make sure that they are driven for the same goals and incentives. At the end of the day, it's about the number of students served and, the charter school space thriving and growing, because I think it's incredible what's being done out there in the education field. So, and then the ability to adjust on the fly. I mean, sometimes you get real short timelines. Sometimes it could be 30 days. In fact, that first instance that we talked about, I think they came to us and we had 30 days to perform on a loan. Don't get me wrong, we don't want to have you come to us 30 days out and, have to do that, because it's a hair on fire experience with our legal teams and finance teams and everybody scrambling to do it. But at the end of the day, can they be flexible to adjust it to your timelines? And, as the school changes, as the situation changes, do they have other wraparound services, things that they can support the school, so that if there is a dip in enrollment, even after you've got into a particular loan or financing structure, can they assist in these other areas too and understand the challenges you're going through at that time? So I just think there's a lot to consider. Just make sure again, these institutions are in line with your thought process. So.
Great. So I think we touched on a lot here, but I think some easy next steps would be to think about your own plan. Think about where you fit on the timeline that we illustrated, and think about what are your both your short and long-term financial plans. If you are in the midst of, say you have a bond that's closing and you need some sort of shorter term solution to address some needs to invest in a property, you're further along in the process than a lot of folks. So I would say in reaching out to different solution providers and looking at different structures, it's good to get out there and see what's out there in the market. And of course, we're here to help. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, wherever you are in the process. We work a lot with schools to help them build plans, assess options. We have various contacts with other lenders and other solution providers. So feel free to use this as a resource. Even if you don't choose to go with us, we're still happy to help. We are, if you flip to the next page, both Ryan and myself, our contact information is on there in case you do want to reach out with any questions. And we're here to help.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Rich. Thanks for covering all that. Thanks for everybody that is listening, and hope everybody is doing well out there and safe under the circumstances.
Ditto. Thanks, everyone.